For weeks, the Japanese inmate never spoke. He ate alone, walked alone, and stared at the floor whenever anyone tried to talk to him. The others mocked him, called him names, laughed when he couldn't answer back. But he never reacted, just kept that same quiet smile. To most, he was just the foreigner. To the guards, just another number on a uniform. No one ever wondered what his silence was hiding. Until one night, when a young female officer dropped her flashlight during rounds, and under her breath, she whispered in Japanese, "Are you okay?" The man slowly looked up, eyes wide for the first time since he arrived. Then, in perfect Japanese, he whispered back, "I've been waiting to hear someone speak my language." And that single sentence changed everything. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next revealed who this man really was and why he ended up behind bars in the first place. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Officer Sarah Martinez had been working the night shift at Riverside Correctional Facility for exactly 8 months when she first encountered inmate 7492. She'd studied Japanese linguistics at university before switching to criminal justice, a decision her parents still questioned every time they called. But tonight, that seemingly useless degree would prove more valuable than any training she'd received at the academy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she made her routine rounds through C Block. Most inmates were asleep, but some sat on their bunks reading under the dim cell lights. Others paced like caged animals, unable to find rest in this concrete maze they now called home. Sarah had learned to read the rhythms of prison life, to spot trouble before it erupted, to maintain authority without unnecessary confrontation. But 7492 was different from the others. While most inmates either demanded attention or avoided it entirely, he seemed to exist in a space between worlds. He followed every rule perfectly, never caused problems, never complained. Yet something about his presence unsettled both guards and prisoners alike. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite wearing the same orange jumpsuit as everyone else. Or maybe it was how he seemed to understand everything happening around him while pretending to comprehend nothing at all. The other inmates had dubbed him Ghost because of how quietly he moved through the daily routines. During meals, he would sit at the corner table farthest from the serving line, eating methodically while chaos erupted around him. In the yard, he walked the perimeter alone, his hands clasped behind his back, like he was strolling through a peaceful garden rather than a prison exercise area surrounded by razor wire. What troubled Sarah most was how the other prisoners treated him. Prison hierarchies were brutal and unforgiving, but usually based on respect or fear. 7492 commanded neither. Instead, he endured a constant stream of verbal harassment that would have driven most men to violence or complete withdrawal. Yet he absorbed every insult, every cruel joke, every deliberate shoulder check with that same serene expression. "Hey, Bruce Lee!" Marcus Thompson would shout across the cafeteria, his voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna karate chop your mashed potatoes?" The table around him would erupt in laughter, while 7492 continued eating as if nothing had happened. Tommy Rodriguez, a lifer with arms covered in gang tattoos, took particular pleasure in tormenting the quiet man. "I bet he don't even speak English," he would announce during yard time. "Probably thinks he's still in China or whatever." When 7492 failed to correct him about his nationality, Tommy would grow bolder, stepping closer, invading his personal space. "What's wrong, Jackie Chan? Cat got your tongue?" The guards weren't much better. Officer Bradley, a 20-year veteran with a beer gut and permanent scowl, referred to him as the Mute in his daily reports. 7492 remained compliant and nonverbal during cell inspection. He would write, never bothering to learn the man's actual name or wonder why someone would choose silence in such a hostile environment. But Sarah noticed things others missed. She saw how 7492's eyes tracked conversations he supposedly couldn't understand. She watched him anticipate meal times and schedule changes before they were announced. Most telling of all, she observed how he positioned himself during conflicts, always managing to be exactly where trouble couldn't reach him. This wasn't the behavior of someone lost in translation. This was strategic survival. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night during her third week of really paying attention to him. Sarah was conducting her 11 o'clock security check when she noticed 7492 sitting on his bunk with his back against the wall, staring at a small photograph. The image was creased and faded from handling, but she could make out what appeared to be a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. As Sarah approached his cell, her flashlight beam caught the edge of her boot, and she stumbled slightly. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its lens cracking against the concrete. Without thinking, she muttered under her breath in Japanese, "Daijubu desu ka?" "Are you okay?" The effect was instantaneous and electric. 7492's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since his arrival. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other through the cell bars. Then, in careful, measured Japanese, he responded, "Watashi wa dareka ga watashi no kotoba wo hanasu no wo mata imashita." "I have been waiting for someone to speak my language." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. She glanced quickly down the corridor to ensure they were alone, then stepped closer to his cell. In Japanese, she whispered, "What is your name?" "Hiroshi," he replied, and for the first time since his incarceration, something resembling hope flickered across his features. "Hiroshi Nakamura." The conversation that followed lasted only minutes, but it shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about the quiet inmate. Hiroshi wasn't just pretending not to understand English. He was protecting himself. He had learned long ago that silence was safer than explanation, that being underestimated was preferable to being truly seen. "Why are you here?" Sarah asked in Japanese, knowing she was crossing professional boundaries, but unable to stop herself. Hiroshi was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Sarah's chest tighten. "I came to America to find my daughter," he said, "but the law does not always understand a father's desperation." Before Sarah could ask more questions, footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Officer Bradley was beginning his rounds early, his heavy boots announcing his approach like thunder. Sarah quickly retrieved her broken flashlight and stepped away from Hiroshi's cell, but not before seeing him mouth two words that would haunt her for the rest of the night. "Arigatou gozaimasu." "Thank you." As Bradley approached, grumbling about inmates who couldn't sleep, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. But inside, her mind raced with questions and possibilities. Who was Hiroshi Nakamura really? What had brought him to America? And what had he done in his search for his daughter that landed him in Riverside Correctional? More importantly, what was she going to do with this information? The next morning brought the usual chaos of shift change, breakfast service and morning roll call. But for Sarah, everything felt different. She found herself watching Hiroshi with new eyes, seeing the intelligence he'd been hiding, recognizing the careful way he navigated each interaction. When Tommy Rodriguez made his usual crude jokes, Sarah noticed how Hiroshi's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When the guards gave contradictory orders, she saw him comply with the correct one, revealing his true understanding of the situation. During her lunch break, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She walked to the administrative offices and requested access to Hiroshi's file. What she found there made her question everything she thought she knew about justice parent, desperation, and the lengths would go to protect their child. But that revelation was only the beginning, because Hiroshi Nakamura wasn't just any concerned father searching for his daughter. He was someone whose story would expose a web of corruption, human trafficking, and international crime that reached far beyond the walls of Riverside Correctional Facility. And Sarah Martinez, A night shift prison guard with a linguistics degree she thought was useless, was about to become the key to unraveling it all. Hiroshi's file read like something from a crime thriller, but Sarah knew every word was documented fact. Born in Osaka in 1978, he had worked as a software engineer for 15 years before his world collapsed. His daughter Yuki had disappeared during what was supposed to be a student exchange program in California. The last communication from her was a frantic phone call where she whispered that she was being held against her will, that the program was fake, that she needed help. Then the line went dead. The Japanese authorities told Hiroshi there was nothing they could do. The American embassy gave him forms to fill out. The FBI said they would investigate. But weeks turned into months with no updates. His ex-wife blamed him for letting Yuki go to America in the first place. His employer grew tired of his absences and emotional outbursts. Everything that mattered to him was slipping away while his daughter remained missing. That's when Hiroshi made the decision that would eventually land him in Riverside Correctional. He liquidated his savings, quit his job, and flew to Los Angeles with nothing but a backpack and a burning determination to find Yuki himself. What he discovered in the shadows of the city shocked him to his core. The student exchange program was indeed fake, operated by a sophisticated human trafficking ring that targeted young women from Asia. They would lure girls with promises of American education and opportunity, then force them into labor, or worse. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the arrest report. Hiroshi had tracked down one of the trafficking operation's safe houses in a warehouse district outside the city. Security footage showed him breaking in at 3 in the morning, moving through the building like a man possessed. He'd found evidence of the operation, documents with names and locations, but no sign of Yuki. When the police arrived, responding to a silent alarm, they found Hiroshi in the warehouse office, photographing files with his phone. He'd injured 2 security guards who tried to stop him, though the report noted his actions appeared to be defensive rather than aggressive. More damaging was what the police found in his hotel room afterward. Maps of other suspected locations, detailed surveillance notes on key figures in the trafficking network, and what prosecutors would later argue was evidence of planned vigilante justice. The charges were serious: breaking and entering, assault, stalking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. But reading between the lines, Sarah could see the real story. A desperate father who had exhausted all legal options and decided to take matters into his own hands. The system had failed him, so he'd tried to become his own system. During his trial, Hiroshi's lawyer had tried to argue temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional distress. The prosecutor painted him as a dangerous individual who thought he was above American law. The judge, perhaps sympathetic to his motivation but bound by legal precedent, sentenced him to 3 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Nowhere in the file was there any mention of whether Yuki had ever been found. Sarah closed the folder and sat back in her chair, feeling sick to her stomach. She thought about all the times she'd watched other inmates mock Hiroshi, calling him names and treating him like he was mentally deficient. She thought about the guards who dismissed him as just another foreign criminal who didn't belong in America. None of them knew they were looking at a father who had risked everything to save his child. That evening, Sarah made another decision that went against every protocol in her training manual. She requested to be assigned to C Block permanently, specifically to the section where Hiroshi was housed. When her supervisor asked why, she simply said she felt she could maintain better order in that area. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Over the next several weeks, Sarah began finding opportunities to speak with Hiroshi during her rounds. Always in Japanese, always when they were alone, always keeping their conversations brief to avoid suspicion. What she learned painted a picture of a man who was slowly being destroyed by uncertainty and guilt. Hiroshi told her about Yuki's childhood, how she'd always been fascinated by American culture and dreamed of studying abroad. He described her laugh, her stubborn streak, her talent for languages. He spoke about the last time he'd seen her at the airport in Osaka, how proud he'd been of her courage to pursue her dreams in a foreign country, how that pride had turned to devastating regret when he realized he'd sent her into danger. "Every day I wonder if she's still alive," he confided one night, his voice barely audible through the cell bars. "Every day I wonder if she's calling my name and I'm not there to answer." Sarah found herself looking forward to these conversations, but also dreading them. Hiroshi's pain was palpable, and she felt helpless to ease it. She was just a prison guard with a linguistics degree, not a detective or a federal agent. What could she possibly do to help him? The answer came from an unexpected source. During one of their late-night talks, Hiroshi mentioned a name that made Sarah's blood run cold: Vincent Chen, the man who had operated the fake exchange program. Hiroshi had never been able to prove Chen was involved in Yuki's disappearance, but all evidence pointed in his direction. The trafficking network had been dismantled after Hiroshi's arrest brought attention to their operation, but Chen had disappeared before authorities could question him. Sarah recognized the name because her younger brother David worked for immigration and customs enforcement. 6 months earlier, during a family barbecue, David had mentioned a case involving a Vincent Chen who was suspected of running multiple identity fraud schemes targeting Asian immigrants. The investigation had stalled due to lack of evidence and Chen's ability to stay one step ahead of federal agents. Could it be the same person? And if so, could there be a connection between Chen's current activities and what had happened to Yuki? That weekend, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She called David and asked if they could meet for coffee. She couldn't tell him about her conversations with Hiroshi, but she could ask general questions about the Chen investigation. What she learned made her realize that Hiroshi's story might be far from over. Vincent Chen wasn't just running identity fraud schemes. According to David's sources, he'd evolved his operation to include document forgery for a new generation of trafficking victims. Young women were still being brought to America under false pretenses, but now their identities were being completely erased and replaced. They became ghosts in the system, impossible to trace, impossible to save. "The problem is, we know he's doing it, but we can't prove it," David explained, stirring sugar into his coffee. "These women are too scared to come forward, and by the time we identify them, their original identities have been so thoroughly buried that we can't figure out where they came from." "What if someone could identify one of the victims?" Sarah asked carefully. "Someone who knew them before they disappeared?" David looked at her suspiciously. "Why are you asking about this case? This isn't exactly dinner conversation material." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I saw it on the news. It just seemed so horrible, and I wondered if there was anything regular people could do to help." "Unless regular people have access to federal databases and witness protection programs, not much," David replied. "But actually, there is one thing that might help. Chen's been using a legitimate business as a front for his operations. A language school in downtown LA that offers English classes to recent immigrants. ICE has been trying to get someone inside for months, but everyone we send gets made immediately. Chen's too smart, and his operation is too careful about who they trust." As David continued talking about the investigation, an idea began forming in Sarah's mind. It was dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely career-ending if it went wrong. But it might be the only chance to find out what happened to Yuki and potentially save other young women from the same fate. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities and consequences. She thought about Hiroshi sitting in his cell, slowly dying from not knowing his daughter's fate. She thought about other fathers in Japan, Korea, China, and the Philippines who might be going through the same nightmare. She thought about young women whose dreams of American education had turned into unimaginable horror. By morning, her decision was made. She was going to help Hiroshi find his daughter, even if it meant risking everything she'd worked for. But first, she needed to know if he was willing to trust her with more than just late-night conversations. She needed to know if he was ready to fight for Yuki one more time, even from behind prison walls. The next phase of their story was about to begin, and neither of them could have imagined where it would lead. But Sarah knew that approaching Hiroshi with her plan would require perfect timing and absolute discretion. One wrong move, one overheard conversation, and both their lives would be destroyed. She spent 3 days observing the patrol patterns of other guards, noting when the security cameras cycled through their rotations, memorizing the exact moments when she could speak to Hiroshi without being detected. On Thursday night, opportunity finally presented itself. Officer Bradley had called in sick, leaving Sarah to cover a double shift that stretched well past midnight. The other guards were either asleep in the break room or focused on their card game in the main office. The inmates had settled into their usual restless sleep, and the only sounds echoing through C Block were the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional cough or snore from behind cell doors. Sarah approached Hiroshi's cell with her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. He was sitting on his bunk, staring at that same photograph of his daughter, his lips moving silently as if he were having a conversation with the image. "Hiroshi-san," she whispered in Japanese, using the respectful honorific that felt appropriate given what she now knew about his situation. He looked up immediately, his eyes alert despite the late hour. In the dim light filtering through the corridor, Sarah could see the hope and wariness fighting for control of his expression. "I need to ask you something very important," she continued in Japanese, glancing quickly down the hallway to ensure they were alone. "But first, I need you to know that I've read your file. I know about Yuki. I know why you're really here." Hiroshi's breath caught in his throat. For months, he had been surrounded by people who saw him only as a criminal, a foreigner who didn't belong in their country. The relief of finally being understood was so overwhelming that tears began streaming down his face. "You know about my daughter?" he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. Sarah nodded, feeling her own emotions threatening to surface. "I know you were trying to save her, and I think I might know how to help you continue that fight, even from in here." What happened next would either be the beginning of the most important partnership of both their lives or the end of everything they'd worked to build. Sarah quickly explained her brother's investigation into Vincent Chen, careful to keep her voice low and her explanations clear. She watched Hiroshi's face transform as he realized that Chen was not only still active, but potentially still trafficking young women through his language school operation. "My brother's team needs someone who can identify Chen and possibly recognize victims," Sarah explained. "Someone who has seen his operation from the inside, who knows how he works, who might be able to spot patterns that trained agents would miss." Hiroshi leaned forward, gripping the bars of his cell so tightly his knuckles went white. "Are you saying there might be a way to find Yuki? That she might still be alive?" "I'm saying there might be a way to find out what happened to her," Sarah replied carefully, "and potentially save other girls who are going through what she went through. But it would require you to trust me completely, and it would be dangerous for both of us." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears as she waited for Hiroshi's response. She knew she was asking him to risk everything on the word of a prison guard he barely knew, to believe that someone in the American justice system might actually care about his daughter's fate. Finally, Hiroshi spoke, his voice steady despite the tears still flowing down his cheeks. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. There was no going back now. She was about to embark on something that could cost her job, her freedom, and possibly her life. But as she looked at Hiroshi's face, seeing the first genuine hope he'd shown in months, she knew she had made the right choice. "First, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Chen's operation. Every detail, no matter how small. The layout of the buildings, the people involved, the way they communicated, how they moved the girls, everything." Over the next hour, Hiroshi provided the most detailed briefing Sarah had ever heard. His engineer's mind had cataloged every aspect of Chen's operation with photographic precision. He described the warehouse where he'd been arrested, but also 3 other locations he'd surveilled before making his move. He drew rough floor plans on scraps of paper, sketching out security systems and escape routes with the skill of someone who had spent months planning a rescue operation. Most importantly, he described Chen himself, not just his physical appearance, but his mannerisms, his speech patterns, the way he interacted with his subordinates. Hiroshi had studied his daughter's captor with the intensity of a man preparing for war. Chen is careful, but he has weaknesses, Hiroshi explained, his voice growing stronger as he shared information that had been locked inside him for months. He's proud of his operation, and he likes to show off to people he thinks he can trust. If someone could get close to him, someone who spoke his language and understood his culture, he might reveal more than he intended. Sarah felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. It was audacious and probably impossible, but it might just work. Hiroshi, what if I told you there was a way you could help the investigation directly? Not from prison, but as part of an official operation. His eyes widened. What are you talking about? Sarah took a deep breath. Federal agencies sometimes use confidential informants, people with specialized knowledge who can provide assistance in exchange for consideration of their cases. If my brother's team believed you could help them get Chen, they might be willing to work out some kind of arrangement. You mean they would let me out of prison? I mean they might be willing to discuss alternatives to your current sentence. Supervised release, electronic monitoring, something that would allow you to assist the investigation while serving the remainder of your time in a different way. Hiroshi stared at her in amazement. After 18 months of believing his life was over, that he would serve his full sentence while his daughter remained missing, or worse. Suddenly, there was a glimmer of possibility. But why would your brother trust someone like me? I'm a convicted felon. I broke the law. Sarah smiled sadly. Because you broke the law trying to save your daughter, and because right now, you might be the only person alive who can help them stop Chen from destroying other families the way he destroyed yours. The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most unusual federal operations in ICE history. Sarah couldn't make any promises, but she could arrange for her brother to meet with Hiroshi unofficially, to hear his story and evaluate whether his information might be valuable enough to justify taking extraordinary measures. If this works, if they agree to use your help, you'll be putting yourself in incredible danger, Sarah warned. Chen's operation has killed people who got too close. You could end up dead, or back in prison for the rest of your life if something goes wrong. Hiroshi's response was immediate and unwavering. If there's even a small chance of finding Yuki, or preventing other fathers from going through what I've experienced, I'll take any risk necessary. As Sarah prepared to end their conversation and continue her rounds, Hiroshi called out to her softly. Martinez-san, he said, using her last name with the same respectful honorific he'd used for her first name. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking so much to help someone like me? Sarah paused, considering her answer carefully. The truth was complicated, involving her own sense of justice, her frustration with a system that often failed the people it was supposed to protect, and her growing respect for a man who had sacrificed everything for love. Because I have a daughter, too, she finally replied, and because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than following the rules. With that, she disappeared corridor, leaving Hiroshi alone into the shadows of the hope for the first time since his arrest. But neither of them could have predicted how quickly their carefully laid plans would be tested, or how dangerous their alliance would become when other people began to notice the changes in both of their behavior. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Officer Bradley returned to work with a black eye and a story about being jumped outside a bar the night before. But Sarah noticed something else about his appearance that made her blood run cold. Tucked partially under his collar was a small tattoo she'd never seen before. 3 interlocking circles with Chinese characters underneath. It was the same symbol Hiroshi had described seeing on documents in Chen's warehouse, the mark that identified members of the trafficking organization. Bradley wasn't just a corrupt guard skimming commissary funds or smuggling contraband. He was working directly for the people who had taken Hiroshi's daughter. And now he knew that Sarah had been spending unusually long periods of time near Hiroshi's cell. The hunt for Yuki was about to become far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous than either Sarah or Hiroshi had imagined. Because the enemy wasn't just outside the prison walls. The enemy was already inside, wearing a badge and carrying keys to every cell in the facility. Sarah's discovery about Officer Bradley's tattoo sent ice through her veins. She forced herself to maintain normal patrol patterns while her mind raced with implications. If Bradley was connected to Chen's organization, then Hiroshi wasn't just fighting for his daughter's life anymore. He was fighting for his own survival inside a system that had been compromised from within. The next 48 hours required Sarah to become an actress worthy of an Academy Award. She smiled and made small talk with Bradley during shift changes, all while studying his every movement for signs of suspicion. She noticed how his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he asked casual questions about her patrol routes that felt anything but casual. Most disturbing of all, she observed Bradley paying unusual attention to Hiroshi's section of C Block. He would find excuses to walk past the cells during times when he normally avoided that area entirely. Once, she caught him standing outside Hiroshi's cell at 3 in the morning, claiming he'd heard suspicious noises that required investigation. Hiroshi sensed the change immediately. During their brief encounters, Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes tracked Bradley's movements with the wariness of prey being stalked by a predator. But they couldn't risk extended conversations anymore. One overheard word in Japanese would confirm Bradley's worst suspicions and potentially sign both their death warrants. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a veteran guard who worked the day shift, approached Sarah in the parking lot after her Friday night shift ended. "Need to talk," Maria said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "But not here. Meet me at Denny's on 5th Minutes." Sarah's stomach dropped. Street in 20. Had Maria witnessed something? Was this the moment her carefully constructed plan fell apart? 20 minutes later, sitting in a corner booth with coffee growing cold between them, Maria delivered news that changed everything. "I've been watching Bradley," she began without preamble. "Something's been off about him for months, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I started noticing his interest in your Japanese inmate." Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral. "What kind of interest?" "The kind that makes me think 7492 might not be safe much longer. Bradley's been making phone calls during his breaks, always in languages I don't recognize. Yesterday, I heard him mention the inmate's cell number specifically." Maria leaned forward, lowering her voice even further. "Sarah, I don't know what's going on, but I think Bradley's planning something, and I think it involves hurting that man." The weight of the moment crashed down on Sarah like an avalanche. She had two choices: maintain her cover and potentially watch Hiroshi die, or trust Maria with information that could destroy them all. "Maria, if I tell you something that sounds completely insane, will you promise to hear me out before you decide I've lost my mind?" Over the next hour, Sarah laid out everything: Hiroshi's real story, the connection to Vincent Chen, Bradley's probable involvement with the trafficking organization, and her brother's federal investigation. She watched Maria's expression cycle through disbelief, shock, anger, and finally, grim determination. "So let me get this straight," Maria said when Sarah finished. "We've got a desperate father in our prison who was trying to save his daughter from human traffickers. One of our own guards is working for those same traffickers, and you're planning to help federal agents use the father as bait to catch the people who destroyed his family." "That's about the size of it," Sarah admitted. Maria was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee while she processed everything she'd heard. Finally, she looked up with steel in her eyes. "What do you need me to do?" The partnership that formed that night between Sarah and Maria would prove crucial in the days that followed. Maria's 23 years of prison experience provided insights that Sarah's 8 months couldn't match. She knew which guards could be trusted, which inmates might be willing to help, and most importantly, how to move information through the facility without triggering official attention. Their first priority was protecting Hiroshi, while Sarah arranged the meeting between him and her brother David. This required a delicate balance of maintaining normal routines while ensuring Bradley never had unsupervised access to Hiroshi's cell. Maria took the day shift in C Block, citing concerns about rising tension between inmates that required experienced oversight. Sarah continued her night patrols but altered her timing slightly, ensuring she was always within shouting distance of Hiroshi's section when Bradley was on duty. The strategy worked for exactly 4 days. On Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived for her shift to find the prison in lockdown. An inmate in C Block had been found unconscious in his cell with severe head trauma. The official report listed it as an accidental fall, but Sarah's blood ran cold when she learned the victim's identity. It was Tommy Rodriguez, the gang member who had spent months tormenting Hiroshi with racist insults and threats. Sarah found Hiroshi in his cell, sitting perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap. His knuckles were scraped and bruised, but his expression remained as serene as always. When their eyes met through the bars, he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear. He hadn't started the fight, but he'd certainly finished it. Later that day, through carefully orchestrated conversations with other inmates, Sarah pieced together what had really happened. Tommy had entered Hiroshi's cell during the early morning shift change, when the corridors were crowded and guards were distracted. He'd been carrying a makeshift weapon and making threats about teaching the quiet guy a lesson. What Tommy hadn't counted on was that Hiroshi's months of silent observation had been spent studying everyone around him, including the fighting techniques of the most dangerous inmates. When Tommy attacked, Hiroshi had responded with precision that suggested formal martial arts training. The incident accomplished 2 things. It established Hiroshi's reputation among the other inmates as someone not to be underestimated, and it sent a clear message to Bradley that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. That night, Bradley made his move. Sarah was conducting her routine midnight rounds when she noticed something wrong immediately. The usual sounds of the prison at night were absent. No snoring, no rustling of sheets, no quiet conversations between cells. The silence was absolute and unnatural. She quickened her pace toward C Block, her hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to her belt. As she rounded the corner into Hiroshi's corridor, she found Bradley standing outside his cell with a syringe in his hand. "Stop right there, Martinez," Bradley said without turning around. His voice carried a cold authority she'd never heard before. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," Sarah replied, her training taking over despite the terror flooding her system. "Step away from that cell, Bradley." He turned slowly, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't the lazy, corrupt guard she'd worked alongside for months. This was someone far more dangerous, someone who had been playing a role just as carefully as she had. "You know, Sarah, you're not nearly as clever as you think you are," Bradley said, taking a step toward her. "Did you really believe we wouldn't notice your sudden interest in our Japanese friend here? Your late-night conversations? Your family connections to federal law enforcement?" Sarah's mind raced. How much did they know? How long had they been watching her? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late for deception. Bradley laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Vincent sends his regards. He's very interested in meeting both you and your boyfriend in there. Unfortunately, only one of you is going to survive long enough to make that introduction." The syringe in his hand caught the fluorescent light as he raised it. Sarah could see the clear liquid inside, could imagine what it would do to Hiroshi's system within minutes of injection. She had seconds to act before a father's desperate search for his daughter ended in a prison cell. murdered by the same organization that had taken her. Sarah's hand closed around her flashlight, the same one that had brought her and Hiroshi together weeks ago. In one fluid motion, she swung it with all her strength at Bradley's wrist. The impact sent the syringe flying across the corridor, where it shattered against the concrete wall. Bradley roared in pain and fury, lunging toward her with his uninjured hand reaching for the nightstick on his belt. But Sarah had already keyed her radio, and her voice echoed through every speaker in the facility. Code Red, C Block, officer needs immediate assistance. Code Red, C Block. What followed was chaos. Guards poured into the corridor from every direction, their radios crackling with confused chatter. Bradley tried to claim that Sarah had attacked him without provocation, that she'd been acting strangely for weeks, and he'd been forced to defend himself. But Maria Santos arrived with backup that Bradley hadn't counted on. She'd been monitoring radio traffic from the parking lot, waiting for exactly this moment. With her came 3 inmates who had witnessed Tommy Rodriguez's accident and were now willing to testify about what they'd really seen. More importantly, she brought David Martinez, who had been sitting in an unmarked car outside the prison for the past 2 hours, waiting for Sarah's signal that it was safe to proceed with their planned meeting. As Bradley was led away in handcuffs, still shouting threats and denials, David approached Hiroshi's cell with the respect due to someone who had just survived an assassination attempt. "Mr. Nakamura," he said in careful Japanese, "my name is David Martinez. I work for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and I understand you have information that could help us find your daughter." Hiroshi looked at this new American official with the same wariness he'd shown everyone else for 18 months. But when his eyes met Sarah's through the crowd of guards and investigators, he saw something that made him nod slowly. "I have been waiting," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear, for someone who would listen to the truth. What happened next would transform a local prison incident into an international investigation that reached from the streets of Los Angeles to the highest levels of organized crime in 3 countries. But first, David needed to hear Hiroshi's full story, not just the sanitized version in his prison file. He needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with and why Vincent Chen had been so determined to silence one Japanese father forever. The debriefing began that very night, in a secure conference room normally used for attorney-client meetings. Sarah sat beside Hiroshi as both translator and witness, while David recorded every word with equipment that would ensure the testimony could be used in federal court. "Tell me about the first time you heard your daughter's voice after she disappeared," David began, and Hiroshi's response would haunt everyone in that room for years to come. "She called me at 3 in the morning, Hiroshi said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "She was crying, but trying to whisper so quietly I could barely hear her. She said, 'Papa, they told me you were dead. They said no one was looking for me. Please, Papa, I'm so scared.'" The line had gone dead before Hiroshi could respond, but the sound of his daughter's terrified voice had driven him to actions that seemed impossible for a mild-mannered software engineer from Osaka. What David learned over the next 6 hours would reshape his understanding of both human trafficking operations and the lengths to which love could drive an ordinary person. But it would also reveal that Yuki Nakamura might still be alive, trapped in a network so sophisticated and brutal that even federal agents had barely begun to understand its scope. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Vincent Chen was learning that his attempt to silence Hiroshi Nakamura had failed spectacularly, setting in motion events that would bring his entire empire crashing down. The war for Yuki's life was about to begin in earnest, with her father finally having allies who believed in his cause and the resources to fight back against seemingly impossible odds. But Chen had advantages too, including connections that reached deep into both criminal organizations and legitimate businesses, resources that could make people disappear without a trace, and most dangerously of all, the knowledge that desperate people would do anything to protect the ones they loved. The battle lines were drawn, and neither side could afford to lose, because for Hiroshi, defeat meant losing his daughter forever. For Chen, it meant spending the rest of his life in federal prison, watching his criminal empire burn to the ground. And for Sarah, it meant discovering that sometimes the most important fight of your life begins with something as simple as a dropped flashlight and a whispered question in a language most people around you don't understand. The real story was just beginning. The federal safe house in downtown Los Angeles looked nothing like what Hiroshi had imagined during his months behind bars. Instead of the sterile government building he'd expected, David had brought him to what appeared to be an ordinary apartment complex, complete with families walking their dogs and children playing in the courtyard. "We've learned that obvious safe houses get compromised quickly," David explained as they climbed the stairs to the third floor. "Chen's network has people everywhere, including some we haven't identified yet. This way, you blend in with normal life while we prepare for the operation." Hiroshi carried only a small bag of personal items that Sarah had helped him gather from his cell. The photograph of Yuki remained folded carefully in his wallet, but now it felt different in his hands. Instead of a memorial to someone he might never see again, it had become a mission briefing photo for the most important assignment of his life. Sarah walked beside them, still adjusting to her new role as a federal liaison. Her prison guard uniform had been replaced with civilian clothes, but she moved with the same alert awareness that had kept her alive during those dangerous weeks at Riverside. The transition from correctional officer to federal operative had happened so quickly that sometimes she still reached for a radio that wasn't there. "The apartment is equipped with everything you'll need," David continued, unlocking a door marked 3B. "Secure communications, surveillance equipment, and most line to our tactical, importantly, a direct team if things go wrong." Inside, the apartment was furnished simply but efficiently. A living room with monitoring equipment disguised as entertainment systems, a kitchen stocked with weeks of supplies, and 2 bedrooms that felt more like a hotel than a temporary operations base. What struck Hiroshi most was the normalcy of it all. After 18 months of concrete walls and steel bars, the sensation of carpet beneath his feet felt like stepping onto another planet. "There's something else you need to see," David said, leading them to a desk where several files were spread open. "We've been monitoring Chen's language school operation for the past month, and we've identified at least 12 young women who match the profile of trafficking victims." Hiroshi's hands trembled as he examined the photographs. Surveillance images taken from across the street showed women entering and leaving the building, their faces partially obscured, but their body language unmistakable. The same hunched shoulders and downcast eyes he remembered from his daughter's last phone call. The posture of people who had learned that invisibility was survival. "None of them is Yuki," he said quietly, though his voice carried relief mixed with disappointment. "But they're all someone's daughter." Sarah studied the images over his shoulder, her law enforcement training allowing her to spot details that civilian eyes might miss. "Look at their wrists," she said, pointing to several of the photographs. "Those marks aren't from jewelry. They're from restraints that were removed recently." David nodded grimly. "Our behavioral analysts reached the same conclusion. These women are being held against their will, but they're being rotated through the school to maintain the appearance of legitimate students. It's brilliant and completely evil." The plan they outlined over the next several hours was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Hiroshi would pose as a recently arrived businessman from Japan, seeking English lessons to help with his American ventures. His background in software engineering provided perfect cover, as Chen's operation specifically targeted educated immigrants who might have valuable skills or family connections. "The key is making Chen believe you're exactly what he's looking for," David explained, spreading out floor plans of the language school. "Wealthy, isolated, and potentially useful to his broader network. He needs to see you as an opportunity, not a threat." Sarah's role would be even more dangerous. Using her linguistics background and knowledge of Asian cultures, she would pose as Hiroshi's American business partner, someone who could provide legitimacy to his story, while also serving as Chen's entry point into broader American markets. Chen trusts people who bring him new opportunities, David continued. If he believes Sarah can help expand his operation, he'll want to keep both of you close. That gives us the best chance of gathering evidence and locating the other victims. Hiroshi studied the photographs again, his engineer's mind analyzing every detail of the building layout and security arrangements. How long do we have before Chen realizes I'm not who I claim to be? Based on our analysis of his previous operations, probably 2 to 3 weeks, David replied. He's careful, but he's also greedy. If you present the right opportunity, he'll take calculated risks to pursue it. The next morning brought their first test run. Hiroshi practiced his cover story in front of mirrors and cameras, refining the persona of a successful but naive businessman who was out of his depth in American culture. Sarah worked on perfecting her role as the helpful American partner who could navigate bureaucratic complexities that might confuse a foreign investor. Remember, Chen will be watching for inconsistencies. David coached them during a particularly intense rehearsal session. He survived this long by being paranoid. Every gesture, every word choice, every moment of hesitation will be analyzed for signs of deception. The weight of the operation pressed down on all of them. They weren't just trying to catch a criminal, they were attempting to rescue in the balance. Every day, young women whose lives hung they spent in preparation was another day those victims remained trapped in a system designed to erase their identities and destroy their hope. But there was another pressure neither Sarah nor David fully understood. For Hiroshi, this wasn't just about justice or even about saving other families from his experience. Every moment of preparation brought him closer to potentially learning his daughter's fate, and that proximity to truth was both motivating and terrifying. "What if we find proof that she's dead?" he asked Sarah during one of their evening briefings, when David had stepped out to coordinate with his supervisors. "What if all of this leads to discovering that I've been hoping for something impossible?" Sarah looked at him with the same steady gaze she'd used during those dangerous midnight conversations in C Block. "Then at least you'll know the truth, and you'll have saved other daughters from the same fate. But what if she's alive but we can't reach her in time? What if our operation puts her in more danger?" "Hiroshi," Sarah said gently, "you've been carrying this weight alone for almost 2 years. Now you have help. Whatever we find, whatever happens, you won't face it by yourself anymore." The trust that had developed between them during those prison conversations had evolved into something deeper during their preparation for the operation. Sarah had risked everything to give Hiroshi this chance, and he had placed his faith in someone who could have easily betrayed him to protect her own career. David returned with news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. "Chen's moving faster than we anticipated," he announced, spreading new surveillance photos across their planning table. "He's scheduled something for next week that involves moving several women to a new location. If we're going to intercept this operation, we need to be inside his organization within the next 72 hours. The photographs showed increased activity around the language school, with several vehicles arriving and departing at unusual hours. More troubling were images of Chen himself, looking more agitated than previous surveillance had captured. Something was pressuring him to act quickly, and that urgency could work either for or against their operation. "We're moving to active phase tomorrow morning," David declared. "Sarah, you'll make first contact by walking into the school as a potential client. Hiroshi, you'll arrive 3 hours later, giving us time to assess Chen's initial response and adjust our approach if necessary." That night, neither Hiroshi nor Sarah slept well. They both understood that once they walked through the doors of Chen's language school, they would be entering enemy territory, with no backup except the surveillance team monitoring from across the street. If Chen suspected their true identities, they could disappear as completely as Yuki and the other victims. But they also knew this might be their only chance to penetrate an organization that had been operating with impunity for years, destroying families and crushing dreams while hiding behind the facade of educational opportunity. As dawn approached, Hiroshi sat by the apartment window, watching early commuters begin their normal day. Somewhere in this city, his daughter might be watching the same sunrise, still hoping that someone would find her. After 18 months of helplessness, he finally had the chance to be the father she needed him to be. The operation was about to begin, and there would be no second chances. Sarah dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that projected confidence without appearing threatening. Her linguistics degree and prison experience had prepared her for many things, but walking voluntarily into a human trafficking operation required a different kind of courage entirely. "Remember, you're not just playing a role," David reminded them during their final briefing. "You're becoming these people completely. Chen has survived by reading people's true intentions, so your cover identity needs to be more than performance. It needs to become reality." At exactly 9:30, Sarah pushed through the glass doors of the New Horizons Language Academy. The lobby was decorated with inspirational posters featuring smiling students and American landmarks, but she immediately noticed details that contradicted the cheerful facade. Security cameras in every corner, reinforced doors that seemed designed to keep people in rather than out, and windows that had been tinted too darkly for normal educational purposes. The receptionist who greeted her was a young Asian woman whose smile never reached her eyes. "Welcome to New Horizons," she said in accented English. "How may we help you today?" "I'm looking for language instruction for my business partner," Sarah explained, maintaining the friendly but professional demeanor they'd rehearsed. "He's recently arrived from Japan and needs to improve his English for our joint ventures." "Of course," the receptionist replied, but Sarah noticed her eyes flick briefly toward a closed office door. "Mr. Chen would be very interested in meeting you. May I ask what type of business you're involved in?" This was the first test. Sarah had anticipated the question and prepared an answer that would intrigue Chen without raising suspicions. "Import-export technology," she said. "My partner has connections with several Japanese manufacturers who are looking to expand into American markets." The receptionist's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more attentive. "Please wait one moment," she said, disappearing through the office door Sarah had noticed earlier. While she waited, Sarah used the opportunity to observe the building's layout and security measures. The lobby connected to at least 3 different corridors, and she could hear voices speaking in multiple languages from deeper within the building. What she couldn't hear were the sounds of normal classroom instruction, the kind of student chatter and lesson activities that should characterize a legitimate language school. When the receptionist returned, she was accompanied by a man Sarah recognized immediately from surveillance photos. Vincent Chen was shorter than she'd expected, with graying hair and expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending his hand with practiced charm. "I understand you're interested in our services for a Japanese business partner." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way his eyes never stopped analyzing her face for signs of deception. "That's correct. He's brilliant with technology but struggles with American business culture. I thought language instruction might help bridge that gap." "Indeed," Chen replied. "We specialize in helping international professionals adapt to American opportunities. Perhaps you'd like to see our facilities while we discuss your partner's specific needs." The tour that followed revealed the true sophistication of Chen's operation. Classrooms that looked legitimate from the doorway, but contained monitoring equipment disguised as educational technology. Computer labs where students worked on exercises that seemed designed more to gather personal information than teach language skills. And throughout the building, young women who moved with the careful awareness of people who had learned that any mistake could bring punishment. "Your students seem very dedicated," Sarah observed, watching a group of women practice English conversation with an instructor whose teaching methods seemed more like interrogation techniques. "We attract serious learners," Chen replied smoothly. "People who understand that success in America requires complete commitment to transformation." The word transformation sent chills down Sarah's spine. In the context of human trafficking, it usually meant the systematic destruction of victims' original identities and their replacement with new personas that served their captors' purposes. "When might your partner be available to visit?" Chen asked as they returned to the lobby. "I find that personal meetings are essential for designing effective educational programs." "He could come this afternoon if that works for you," Sarah replied, knowing that Hiroshi was already preparing for his part of the operation. Chen's smile widened. "Excellent. Shall we say 1 o'clock? I'm very interested in learning more about his technological expertise and business connections." As Sarah left the building, she resisted the urge to look back at the surveillance team monitoring from across the street. She'd successfully made first contact and established Hiroshi's introduction. But she'd also confirmed their worst fears about the true nature of Chen's operation. The women in that building weren't students. They were prisoners whose education consisted of learning to obey orders and accept their fate. In 3 hours, Hiroshi would walk through those same doors, carrying with him not just the hopes of finding his daughter, but the weight of potentially saving every young woman trapped inside Chen's carefully constructed hell. The most dangerous phase of their operation was about to begin, and there was no guarantee that any of them would emerge unchanged by what they discovered in the depths of the New Horizons Language Academy. But for the first time since Yuki's disappearance, her father had allies who understood that some fights were worth any risk, and some truths were worth any sacrifice to uncover. The clock was ticking, and Vincent Chen had no idea that his perfectly constructed world was about to be invaded by a father's love and a prison guard's determination to see justice served. At exactly 1 o'clock, Hiroshi walked through the glass doors of the New Horizons Language Academy, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every step toward the reception desk felt like walking deeper into the belly of the beast that had swallowed his daughter whole. The cheerful educational posters on the walls mocked him with their promises of American dreams and bright futures, when he knew the reality lurking behind Chen's operation was nothing but nightmares. The same receptionist greeted him with that hollow smile, but this time her eyes held a different quality of assessment. "Mr. Nakamura, welcome. Mr. Chen is expecting you." Hiroshi nodded, maintaining the slightly overwhelmed expression of a businessman out of his cultural depth. "Thank you. I hope I'm not late. American traffic is very different from Osaka." "Not at all," she replied, leading him toward the office where Vincent Chen waited. "Mr. Chen understands the challenges of adapting to a new country." The irony of those words nearly broke Hiroshi's composure. Chen understood adaptation, all right. He specialized in forcing young women to adapt to lives they never chose, in countries that offered them no protection. Chen's office was larger than it had appeared from the lobby, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a commanding view of the street below. Surveillance monitors were cleverly disguised as decorative screens, and Hiroshi spotted at least 3 different camera angles covering the room's interior. This wasn't just an office. It was a command center designed to monitor everything that happened within Chen's empire. "Mr. Nakamura," Chen said, rising from behind an imposing mahogany desk, "your partner speaks very highly of your technological expertise. Ms. Martinez is too kind," Hiroshi replied, bowing slightly in the traditional Japanese manner. "I am simply trying to understand American business customs so I can serve my clients better." Chen's eyes lit up with interest. "And what type of technology do you specialize in?" This was the moment everything hinged on. Hiroshi had spent days memorizing technical details that would sound impressive without being easily verifiable. "Advanced database management systems," he said, "particularly for tracking complex supply chains and managing large volumes of personal data." The words were carefully chosen to appeal to Chen's specific needs. A human trafficking operation required sophisticated databases to track victims, clients, and financial transactions, while avoiding detection by law enforcement. If Chen believed Hiroshi could improve those systems, he would want to keep him very close indeed. "Fascinating," Chen murmured, leaning forward with genuine interest. Data security must be a constant concern in your field. Absolutely, Hiroshi agreed. My clients often handle very sensitive information that must never fall into the wrong hands. Privacy and discretion are everything in my business. Chen smiled, but Hiroshi caught something predatory flickering behind his eyes. I believe we may have more to discuss than just English language instruction. Would you be interested in seeing some of our advanced educational facilities? We have computer labs that might interest someone with your technical background. As they left the office, Hiroshi's trained eye cataloged every security measure, every exit route, every detail that might prove crucial if the operation went sideways. The building was a fortress disguised as a school, with multiple layers of control designed to prevent anyone from leaving without permission. The computer lab Chen showed him was impressive and horrifying in equal measure. 24 young women sat at individual workstations, their fingers moving across keyboards with mechanical precision. But their screens weren't displaying language lessons. Instead, Hiroshi saw databases filled with personal information, financial records, and what appeared to be scheduling systems for human cargo. Our students learn practical computer skills alongside English, Chen explained, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was sharing something special with a potential partner. Many of them become quite valuable to American businesses that need workers with specialized database experience. Hiroshi felt bile rise in his throat as he watched the women work. They weren't learning marketable skills. They were being trained to manage their own exploitation. The databases they maintained probably contained the records of other victims, creating a system where the trafficked became complicit in trafficking others. This story shows us that sometimes the most powerful connections happen when we least expect them. A dropped flashlight, a whispered question, in a foreign language, and suddenly two strangers became allies in an impossible fight. Hiroshi's silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. And Sarah's willingness to listen beyond language barriers didn't just save one man's life, it potentially saved countless others. Sometimes being truly seen requires someone brave enough to look past the surface and hear what isn't being said.